Up next on the History Channel, it's Exploring History, the Marshall Plan, followed by Ice Road Truckers at 9.
Hello, welcome to Exploring History on the History Channel. I'm historian Alexander Davis, and today we examine the Marshall Plan. Why was it implemented? How did it change the international community? And what effects does it still have today? Find out the answers to these questions and more. To fully understand the Marshall Plan, it is necessary to understand the context surrounding this policy. World War II had just ended, and the world was not looking good.
World War II was the single deadliest conflict known to mankind. The war saw the world's largest and most technologically advanced countries face one another for 6 brutal years of conflict. Europe was especially devastated as it was caught in the crosshairs of Nazi Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The new trend of aerial warfare brought devastation to the farms, infrastructure, bridges, and cities of Europe. The United States, by contrast, protected by 2 oceans, had virtually no structural damage. By the end of the war, the United States had developed atomic weapons and controlled nearly 1/2 of the world's manufacturing capacity. This set the stage for the necessity of United States aid in the devastated Western Europe. In Europe, there was devastation on a scale never before seen. Poland, for example, lost nearly 17% of its pre-war population. The Netherlands, a tiny country, lost 210,000 people, many due to the Holocaust. Europe needed some way to heal and repair itself after such a disastrous war. The precedent for United States foreign aid to Europe was set in 1947 by President Harry Truman in his speech to Congress that is now known as the Truman Doctrine. In order to prevent the spread of communism and stabilize the economies of Greece and Turkey, President Truman petitioned the United States Congress for $400 million in order to send military and financial assistance. Here is a brief excerpt from that speech.
If Greece should fall under the control of an armed minority, the effect upon its neighbor Turkey would be immediate and serious. Confusion and disorder might well spread throughout the entire Middle East.
To further elaborate, here is Greek historian Nikolaos Anastasopoulos.
Following World War II, Greece found itself in a position vastly different from that of the United States. 4 years of Nazi occupation and a brutal Nazi retreat in 1944 left the country in ruins. Thousands of villages were pillaged, railroads, bridges, and infrastructure were virtually non-existent, and inflation had skyrocketed. The country had become desperate, and a national liberation army of communist forces had taken power in the north along the border of Yugoslavia. This began a guerrilla war that lasted nearly 3 years. Thankfully, in 1947, under the new Truman Doctrine, President Harry Truman gave Greece the help it so desperately needed.
Then Secretary of State George Marshall decided to expand upon the precedent set by President Truman. The Marshall Plan offered massive economic assistance to the nations of Europe in the form of food, financial assistance, and industrial investments. In 1948, Congress passed the Economic Cooperation Act, which appropriated nearly $13 billion, or $130 billion in today's money. George Marshall unveiled this plan in a 1947 summer speech at Harvard University to nearly 15,000 attendees. To elaborate is his personal assistant.
I remember back in the day, I had just gotten out of college, maybe 20 years old, and I was super lucky to get a job as the personal assistant to Secretary of State John Marshall. It was late May of 1947, and he told me to gather Chit Bolin, a Russian Soviet-speaking expert, and William L. Clayton, the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, because they needed to write a speech for a trip to Harvard in 2 weeks. I was initially a little confused as to what was going on, but I, of course, did what was asked of me. 2 weeks later, I remember we arrived at Harvard, what I thought would be, just a small informal speech, but over 15,000 people had gathered there. And my boss, Secretary of State Marshall, stood up and gave a speech where he committed the United States to examine aid packages for all of Western Europe, a truly revolutionary idea. I remember how the crowd went wild after that, and 6 months later the United States put into action the Marshall Plan, in namesake of my boss, George Marshall. He even went on to win a Nobel Prize, and it all started on the June 5th, 1947, when he gave that historic speech, and I'm just proud I was a part of such a great moment in history.
Under the terms of the Economic Cooperation Act, Marshall Plan aid was continually given for 4 years until 1952. To fully explain how this influx of funds affected the economies of Europe, we have a prominent economist with us today on the program.
The effects of the Marshall Plan on the economies of Western Europe was extreme. From 1948 onward, each economy experienced unprecedented growth rates. France, for example, had consistent growth rates of nearly 5% for over 3 decades, unheard of in a developed economy. Italy had growth rates in excess of 6% for nearly all of the 1950s. In addition to pure economic growth, quality of life increased for all of the citizens too. Things such as the birth rate, literacy rate, real GDP per capita, life expectancy all increased during this time period. A lot of this can be directly attributed to the Marshall Plan aid, including food, machinery, and investments in European industry. In addition to the pure economic impacts, the Marshall Plan also helped further integrate the economies of the United States and Europe. It also laid a groundwork for the future establishment of NATO, an organization that still exists today. Due to the increased stability of Europe's economies, the Marshall Plan is often cited as an initial step toward European integration, which truly began later in the 1950s with the creation of the European Steel and Coal Community. The Marshall Plan was truly a great piece of American policy that forever changed the economies of Europe.
Despite the glowing review of the previous economist, the Marshall Plan remains highly controversial. Certain economists attribute Europe's miraculous growth to sources other than the Marshall Plan. The plan is also seen as being very divisive, as Stalin and leaders of the Eastern Bloc accuse the United States of simply trying to buy influence in Europe with no real commitment to the region. Regardless of your views on the plan, it is undeniable that the Marshall Plan had significant impact on American foreign policy. It legitimized foreign aid packages, which have been frequently used in the Cold War and up until the present day. We thank you for watching this program on the History Channel and hope you return next week to Exploring History.